Hi there. Welcome to Mushroom Hour. Today on Mushroom Hour, we have the honor of speaking with Martin Ball. Martin is a Ph.D. writer, independent publisher, energy worker, visionary artist, and musician. In the spring of 2009, Martin underwent a profound energetic opening and transformation, the product of intensive work with entheogenic medicines and a year of profound self-exploration. The result is Martin's articulation of what he calls the entheological paradigm, a grand unified theory of all of reality, from God to the direct experience of each human being, which he characterizes as an articulation of his view on radical non-duality. The result is a view of the nature of reality and the self that is challenging, liberating, and powerfully transformative, pointing to the true nature of being and personal responsibility as an energetic being. Martin earned his MA and PhD from UC Santa Barbara in religious studies in 2000, with an emphasis on Native American traditions, philosophy of science and religion, and the phenomenology of mystical and shamanic experience, as well as the role of entheogens in religious and spiritual experience. It was with the release of Mushroom Wisdom in 2006 that Martin started his career as a public advocate for entheogenic reform and education. I'm excited to learn about the use of entheogens to glean deeper understandings of our reality, especially as it pertains to those infamous psilocybin-containing mushrooms that we know and love. Martin, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure.
Well, the honor is all mine. In diving into some of your books, there is a whole different view of the universe that I really resonate with that you lay out there. And it sounds like entheogens have been a big part of kind of showing you some of these understandings that you've really downloaded or received.
Definitely. My work with entheogens has been absolutely fundamental to my worldview, my sense of self, my sense of reality, and in a very constructive way. And also in some ways a destructive way, in the sense of being able to let go of certain beliefs or ideas and come to also a very positive view of what reality is and what it isn't. Yeah, for me, and we're on the Mushroom Hour podcast, that for me, it really started, I classify cannabis as a low-level psychedelic. So that's really where I started. But, in terms of the classic psychedelics, I got started with psilocybin mushrooms. Was my real introduction to the world of psychedelics and entheogens.
Well, and it's funny because it's the introduction for so many people, both into entheogens and a lot of times into mycology. You talk to a lot of people who are into mushrooms or the study of mycology or mycophagy, going collecting mushrooms. And like 90% of people have a story of, it all started when I was 15 and tried psilocybin-containing mushrooms. So it's interesting. They're kind of these ambassadors to that world of entheogenic medicine that seems to like unlock new parts of people's being or parts of people's spirit that make them more open to further explorations down those pathways. And I love the idea that you've been disabused in reading your work. You've been disabused of some of our traditional cultural notions of how the world works, the narratives we tell about it, and you're not left like bereft of guidance or bereft of a compass. You've actually constructed a really valuable compass outside of those standard cultural values. That's really cool to see, and just something I don't often hear elucidated as well as you have.
Well, I'm not surprised that a lot of people who are into mycology get their start with psilocybin mushrooms, because they're just absolutely fascinating. I mean, just the idea that this little thing grows out of the ground and you can eat it, and it contains these really powerful neurotransmitters that radically alter, and not just alter, but I would also say enhance our perception and experience of reality, in and of itself is just kind of mind-blowing that these psychedelic foods exist in nature. For me, that was a big part of my interest in mushrooms early on, was that, wow, this is just something that grows. I mean, it's just out there. You don't really need to do anything about it. You eat it, and then these amazing experiences unfold. And for a lot of people, a big part of the experience can be these feelings of connection and interbeing and interconnectedness. And of course, we all know that that's how mushrooms operate, that there's these mycelial networks underneath the ground of how they're all communicating and interacting with each other, and how you might have even just a huge field of mushrooms, and it's actually all the same living being. And so both intellectually, creatively, spiritually, yeah, it's no wonder that people get started in mycology by having a psilocybin experience and then just wanting to know more about mushrooms in general, because if they have these properties, these mind manifesting, that's what the word psychedelic means, is actually mind
Mm,
manifesting. If they have these mind manifesting properties, well then what other properties might they have?
right. And psilocybin just happens to be this vector by which we feel like we're communing with that consciousness or seeing through the consciousness of the fungi somehow. You get that sense of connection that seems innate when we talk about fungi, symbiosis and connection. At least that's what it conjures up for me, is this idea that this is the one chance we get to almost see through the eyes of fungi, this organism that is so ubiquitous in our environment, but we can't really interact with. It seems like one of the only meaningful ways to really have an interaction or relationship with them in some ways.
Yeah, and it really does present that way for many people, this feeling of communing with the mushrooms somehow. That, at this point I have a very non-dual approach to things, which you've already described, where
Right.
I really look at reality as all of reality is actually just one consciousness interacting with itself through various guises. And so then the medium of psilocybin mushrooms is a particular lens, or a particular, more so than a lens, would be a particular energetic construct through which consciousness can interact with itself across multiple levels, so that there's this can be this sense of, I am communing with the mushroom, or I am experiencing deeper unconscious parts of my personal egoic self. And then there's transpersonal, archetypal forms of consciousness. And then, really at what I would consider to be the peak is unitary consciousness, this
Right.
sense of, wow, everything really is all one. And not just in the sense of things are connected to each other, things are interrelated to each other, but that they are literally one, that there's one consciousness, there's one being that interacts with itself across all these multiple levels. And a lot of these levels of consciousness are just not available to ordinary everyday consciousness and perception. So it does take some kind of catalyst in order to enter people into those states. And that's why, when we look at religions and spiritual traditions, not only is there traditional use of psychedelics and entheogens across multiple cultures throughout history,
Right.
but there's all other kinds of ways that people have looked to induce psychedelic or mind expanding states: drumming, fasting, sexual activity, austerities, starving yourself for a time period, secluding yourself in darkness. So there's different methodologies, but it opens up these different ways of perceiving and being.
And as you describe in your book, Mushroom Wisdom, communing with psilocybin mushrooms, consuming psilocybin mushrooms is one of the most attainable ways to do, what years of meditation or austerity or starvation is trying to get to. So it's like one of these most approachable ways to tap into that sense of unitary consciousness. And this kind of gets to that underpinning worldview you have that you just explained, that I think is such a different conception. I mean, a lot of times, like I'll say colloquially, yeah, we are all one. Everything's one. And we kind of innately understand that. But I guess in your model, what is small question? What is a human being and how do we fit in? How are we unique in that we are individuated units of this generative principle? But I guess, how are we unique in that model and what is the role that we're filling?
Well, I guess to answer that, I would start with what is the nature of the whole, and then we can kind of filter down to what the human
Yeah.
being is. So the way that I perceive and understand and articulate it through my entheogenic experiences is, I like to use the word God. For me, this is something that developed from my first full 5-MeO DMT experience, which is a tryptamine, like in psilocybin mushrooms. That's also a tryptamine. So this is another form of tryptamine. It's actually another form of DMT. I think psilocybin is 4-HO DMT, or it could be 4-OH. I could have my letters letters wrong.
I'd be lying
But
if I said I didn't have to go on the internet to check that one.
yeah, I'd have to do a fact check on that one. But it's a form of DMT, and then there's 5-MeO DMT, which is very, 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 very powerful. And anyway, my very first full experience with 5-MeO DMT, it was something that was vaporized, and within seconds of having taken in this hit, it was just this experience of, oh my God, it's God. that, this is not a concept, this is not a belief, it's just, oh my God, it's God, in the sense that what was unfolding was this sense of absolute infinite energy, infinite consciousness, infinite being, and infinite unconditional love. And that this being, this entity, was everything that existed, all space, all time, all dimension, all everything. And that included me, myself, as a human being. That this thing, this being, this consciousness was everyone and everything, and all the time. Really, with 5-MeO DMT, was just like ripping away the veils of dualistic illusion of, well, I'm me, you're you, you're over there, I'm over here, everything's separate, everything is, its own discrete thing. And it was just very clear that, wow, everything really is literally one. And for me, that was a very important experience because, as you've mentioned, that I have my degree in religious studies. So I've studied a lot about mystical and religious traditions and what these experiences are. And so I had certain ideas and I had certain beliefs and certain desires for some things to be true and things like that. And through having this experience myself, quickly realized that any idea that I had of what I thought that might be simply wasn't it. Mm-hmm. That, this is an experience that we can do our best to articulate through language, but we can't really capture it through language. And that when it's presented in such a palpable way, it's not even something that you can describe as a belief or as an idea, because it presents itself as just the obvious true nature of being and reality. Okay, so at the heart of reality is this unitary consciousness and being that is made out of patterns of energy. All energy is patterned and structured in some way. Okay, and that these patterns of energy, by interacting with each other and through the limitations that are achieved through patterning, then we're able to get what we commonly refer to as the physical world, right? That when we get down to like quarks and subatomic particles, these are little packets of energy. And when these little packets of energy interact with each other, that they form these larger structures called atoms, which all have various frequencies and vibrations. They're patterns of energy, and those atoms coalesce into molecules, and those molecules form chemicals, and those chemicals form substances and matter. And all that we experience in space and time are these various kinds of energies constantly interacting with each other, and through their interaction, transforming. So this being that I call God is an evolutionary process of energetic transformation that is continually occurring. And through that, we get what we call the physical world. Now, this physical world, we can talk about consciousness, and there is this idea that consciousness is some kind of epiphenomenon of the brain. That so if you get the right molecules together in the right way and the right patterns, that then boom, consciousness is suddenly produced. And my model kind of flips it on its head and saying that, well, actually, consciousness is the context in which the physical then exists, because there is this unitary consciousness that is just, it's there. Didn't come from anywhere. It's not going anywhere. It's simply there. It is the nature of what is. But this consciousness is parceled out through these patterns of energy. So the physical universe, we could say, arises within the consciousness of God.
So consciousness in this model of understanding is more like that latent energy that's everywhere. I mean, is this basically what the raw material that's being pulled from to create these package of energy that's then coalescing into form? I mean, you're starting with just this giant expanse of pure consciousness that all this is coalescing out of.
Yes,
And that
yes.
really challenges that idea, because when we think of consciousness, we think of sentience. We think like, the wall can't be conscious, a rock can't be conscious. But actually, when you break it down, what you're saying to those fundamental particles, they're energy born of consciousness. It's just not quite how we understand it necessarily.
Yeah. And so, when we get to the human being, well, first let's just deal with like inorganic physical reality.
Yeah.
And so I would say that here we have objects that exist within consciousness, and that they do have a very low level of what we might call awareness, but they certainly don't have agency in the sense that a living being has agency. Like an atom can only make it like a binary choice, like a yes or no, this level or that level, something
Right.
like that. And, so a wall's not doing much, but it still exists within consciousness. And it doesn't have a personality, it doesn't have an identity. That there you need a really sophisticated vehicle. So through the inorganic process of the transformation of reality from, if there was a big bang, we can say there was this massive explosion of energy, and then it takes time for that to cool down into stabilized structures and patterns that then can coalesce into physical objects. And then you give that enough billions of years, and then you just might get one system where you have a planet that's just the right distance from its sun, that has the right amount of chemical elements in which biological life can then start to evolve. And then it starts very simply and it grows more complex over time. And living beings, I like to refer to them as kind of reality enjoyment vehicles. So through living beings, God, this universal unitary consciousness, gets to experience itself from a particular perspective, which
Right.
is very different than universal consciousness. Because in universal consciousness, there's no subject object. But through living things, we can start to make these distinctions between subject and object. So even an amoeba seeks out sources of energy. Right. So
Right.
there's a rudimentary level of subject object relationship there, where the little amoeba is floating around in the water and it senses, oh, there's something over here I can eat. So it goes over there and sucks it up and eats it. But then through the process of evolution, that these organic beings become more and more complex. And then what we finally get to with the human being, here is where the brain is very important. That the mechanisms through which consciousness is processed does affect the awareness. Okay. So by having sophisticated enough brains, human beings are able to have self-awareness. And another way of putting that is that, we have an ego. And I always like to make a distinction with my dog, for example. This is my dog's right over here. It's Moxie. She's a good girl. But she doesn't have self-awareness in the same way that a human being does. Right. She's far more sophisticated than an amoeba. So she has a rich inner life of emotion and experience and desire, which an amoeba probably does not have. Amoeba just thinks, where's food, where's food, where's food? Oh, time to divide. Where's food, where's food? Right? Whereas as a dog, she can look forward to playing ball or going on a hike and gets excited about things, and she can be sad, and so she has a rich life as a living being. But what she doesn't have is this level of self-awareness that says, I'm a dog, and am I a good dog? What does it really mean to be a good dog? Was I a good dog today? Is there something I should do so that I could be a better dog
We
tomorrow?
don't think she has those thoughts. She may.
Yeah. Well, there's no real evidence of that.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I'm going off of. That
Sure.
There's no, like, if somebody knocks on the door, she barks. And then I say, oh, Moxie, stop barking. And she knows that I don't like it when she barks, but she still does it anyway. Whereas, with a human being, you can tell them, don't do that. And they're like, oh, have I been bad? What do I need to do to be good? Right. So we have this level of self-awareness. We have this egoic awareness where we're not only are we aware, but we're aware that we're aware. And through that, we are able to question who we are, who we think we should be, what kind of reality do we live in, what is the purpose of it, what is the meaning. So in other words, we're these very sophisticated reality enjoyment vehicles. And because we have this egoic sense of self, this egoic self-awareness, that we're able to question the nature of reality, question the nature of our perception. And we also have the ability to edit and censor ourselves. So this is, somewhere where I would say, the dog does not have the ability to edit or censor herself. That if she's excited, she's going to wag her tail,
Right.
Whereas a human being can be like, don't show your excitement. Don't do it. Don't do it. That we can hold ourselves back. She can't, because she doesn't have that second level of self-awareness that edits and censors who she is. She just is who she is. But human beings are constantly being who and what we think we should be, or what we've been told we should be.
Sometimes to our detriment, but really a big theme I'm taking away is, in this worldview that you've constructed, consciousness is not the same as self-awareness. It's not the same as sentience.
Right.
And that's huge, because I think for a lot of people, when they conjure up the idea of consciousness, it's basically, being in the human enjoyment vehicle. That's what consciousness is. And you're saying, no, consciousness, it's not, I don't want to use an analogy like dark matter or something, but it's like, it's this ubiquitous field. I almost think of it like in the way you describe it, like a source field, a morphogenic field that energy coalesces and emerges out of. And that's a really, really interesting distinction. And what I'm also hearing here is that ego, as much as we always want to obliterate the ego bad, the ego has a purpose in being like this highly tuned or evolved channel of consciousness to then do kind of that inevitable step in this great, vast, singular being, is to eventually look at itself.
Yes.
So the ego kind of functions that way. So it has a function. It's not like we need to all make sure we kill our egos and leave them for dead.
Yeah. And that's just a really, really terrible idea that gets promoted in a lot of spiritual traditions. This idea of, well, you've got to kill the ego and get rid of the ego, and the ego is bad. And there's absolutely nothing inherently wrong with the ego. And the ego, in fact, is the gift that allows us to be self-aware. And through our self-awareness, all of our art, music, philosophy, architecture, sciences, mathematics, languages, writing, theater, entertainment, storytelling, all of that is a product of the ego. So everything that human beings have ever accomplished is because we have egos. And that's why, when we look around at the animal kingdom, we can see, the more sophisticated animals, dolphins, chimpanzees, great apes, things like that, that they do have elements of culture within them. That not every pod of dolphins behaves the same way all around the world, that there are localized differences. And there are other minor localized differences among other species of animals, but nothing to the degree that we see among human beings. Sometimes people take issue with me. They say that I'm being like humanist, or that I'm being too anthropomorphic, that, it's like, oh, you're just going back to that old Judeo-Christian thing that only human beings are created in the image of God and therefore they're better than anything else. And I'm not trying to say that. I'm just saying that we are more sophisticated, and that the evidence is that we're talking via Zoom across two different places here on the planet. And the only reason we're able to do that is because human beings have become self-aware, which then allows us to question what is the nature of reality, and gives us the tool through which we can then investigate the nature of reality. And the danger with the ego is that it can invent all kinds of answers to these questions that simply are not true, but then it attaches themselves to those answers, and those become belief systems. And that those are not reflections of reality, those are reflections of belief systems. But science, mathematics, physics, the things that make this communication that we're having now possible, this is not built on beliefs. This is based on accurate measurement and sort of deconstruction of the nature of reality, and then remaking it in ways to suit our ends. And all of that is accomplished through the ego. So the ego is really quite an amazing, amazing thing. It's just prone to making up stuff, because ego, see, unlike the dog does not ask, what is the meaning of things? The ego does ask, what is the meaning? What is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of my life? What is the purpose? So that we invent answers, but then because we want those answers to be true to some sense. And so there's a difference between genuine knowledge and belief systems. But then through the ego, that's what gives us the quest to like, well, I want to figure out what reality is.
Right.
And then we also have the possibility of transcending the ego through something like psilocybin. And that's what allows us to enter into unitary states of consciousness, where then we can say, oh, wow, it really is all one. And I'm also this human being. I am one with everything. I am this universal consciousness, but that doesn't override the fact that I'm still the individual that I am.
It's almost this tool where we can be saved by seeing it. We can be saved by an overactive ego just by identifying it as the tool that it is, and then rise to that level of unitary consciousness where we're able to put it in its perspective. Now, in this level of energetics, what is this little secret key that is tryptamine? I mean, what are some of these chemicals that seem to enable us to go above the ego and suddenly access a different layer of consciousness? The vision I have is like an energetic porthole that just suddenly transfers your energy into this higher space of understanding. To put that in an actual question, do you think that these are purposeful in the creation of the universe to help the highly attuned consciousness ego vehicles to be able to put it in perspective and not go overboard? Do you think it's just random chance that these molecules exist? You know, in the context of psilocybin, I've asked many people who are into psilocybin mushrooms, experts at identification, attempts at seeing evolutionary history. And one of the consensus is, well, you know, mushrooms create millions of different alkaloids, millions of different secondary metabolites. That's just one of them. And but in what you're laying out, I like to think there might be a purpose there, and that, you know, it's kind of left there by this big unitary being to be able to let us access those higher states. What are your thoughts about that jumble of thoughts I threw out there?
Yeah, well, I think that it's always kind of tricky when we get into questions of, well, what is the meaning? What are the purpose, right? Because that's where it's really easy for the ego to
The ego
speculate.
getting us into trouble.
Yeah, but I mean, what we do know is that all biological life has evolved in concert with itself, right? That we are all part of the ecology. Now, as human beings, you know, we do tend to think of ourselves as standing outside of any particular ecology because we've been able to manipulate reality so that we could live in virtually any environment. But we've all grown up together. I mean, all of life is bound together on this planet. And nature also tends to be very conservative, so it can use the same thing for multiple purposes. And if something works, then it keeps working. There are certain biological drives. You know, I think that, I don't know the exact number, but I think that there might be something like 8 different forms of eyeballs that have evolved in living beings. You know, not all eyeballs are related to each other, that there's different kinds of eyesight that animals have evolved. But what we can see is that, well, seeing things is important because, again, ultimately, we are energetic beings living in an energetic reality. Light is a form of energy, so that living beings, that they develop organs that are able to sense light only makes sense,
Right.
right? In the same sense that we can feel hot, we can feel cold, we can feel rough, we can feel smooth, we can feel hard, we can feel soft. These are all energies. And then also in our inner life, our thoughts are energies, our emotions are energies, so that everything about us is about processing and sensing energy. Now, tryptamines, whether by design or just by evolutionary accident, that is how the neurological system functions inside mammals. Mammals are basically tryptamine processing conscious agents, okay? Again, we can't really say it's by design. It's just the way that things are. So, for example, serotonin, which is our normal everyday waking consciousness neurotransmitter, is a tryptamine. I mean, it has this basic molecular structure of a tryptamine. Melatonin, which is the neurotransmitter that our brains produce that says, okay, it's time to go to sleep now.
Yeah.
Here you go. It's time for dream time. Melatonin is also a tryptamine. Okay. Now, all mammals have these tryptamines in them that regulate waking and sleeping consciousness. Also, all mammals on the planet produce at least trace amounts of dimethyltryptamine, DMT, as well as 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, 5-MeO-DMT. Every single mammal on the planet has these things in them. Also, DMT and 5-MeO-DMT are widely present in the plant kingdom. Now,
Right.
plants evolved before mammals. Okay, so tryptamines were already present within the environment. So that's what I mean, that nature reuses things, right? So DMT
Yeah.
and 5-MeO, they were produced in plants. I think some people have speculated that they might be, serve as like insecticides or something like that, or that keep the bugs from eating the plants. But in mammals, it got repurposed for consciousness. And of course, plants themselves, they have their own level of consciousness. It's nowhere at the same level of agency and expression that we have as human beings, but they have their own levels of consciousness that they sense light, they sense heat, they sense when it's cold, they sense when it's hot, when it's dry, when it's wet. Any kind of sensory function has some kind of consciousness. Really, if we want to get into sort of like the grand picture of it, that if we say, well, look, if all of reality has been God evolving itself into ever more sophisticated biological forms, okay, here's where we're kind of getting into metaphysics and theology. But one way of putting it is that God loves itself so much that it would never evolve itself into a prison that it couldn't see its way out of.
So that ego would be that prison, and it's leaving us little tools to see outside it.
Yeah, and that
Yeah.
these tools are just naturally built into reality, that they're there,
Yeah.
right? Because God is all powerful, but God actually can't limit itself because it has to be itself. So that for us to participate in the reality game, we have to convince ourselves that, well, you're just you and I'm just me. We have to really believe that. It's kind of like, one way that I put it is that there's only one actor and there's billions of characters. And those characters, that they really believe in the reality of their character. And that ultimately, it kind of relates back to entertainment and theater, or movies. Like when you watch a movie, what you want to see is an actor who is so good that you really believe that he or she is that person that they're portraying. What we don't
Right.
want to see is an actor who's acting. It's like, oh, this person's acting and they're doing a terrible job, right? We
Right.
want it to be believable. And life is kind of like that reality is God's theater through which it's able to experience everything that's possible to experience. And it is exploring all possibilities simultaneously.
And it would almost, in that analogy, it would almost be like God puts little pieces in the script to remind us that, hey, just so you know, there's only one actor, you're playing this character, just so you don't go overboard and really think you're this character and kind of lose your mind a little bit or lose yourself.
Yeah, it wouldn't willingly deny itself knowledge of itself. And that
Yeah.
it actually can't do that at the deepest level. But then, at the neurological level, what we're dealing with then are neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters in their purest form are actually these little crystals that,
Mm.
they form these little crystalline structures. Like if you have pure DMT or pure psilocybin, it actually would be a little crystal.
Yeah.
And what crystals do, and I'm not trying to be metaphysical in any way, that what crystals do is that through the crystalline lattice and structure of the crystal, it's able to transmit energy in particular ways. So different crystals have different abilities to transmit energy in different ways. Okay, so serotonin, the crystalline structure of serotonin, when it attaches to the neurons on our brain, and it's also important to note, if people aren't aware of this, that actually I think it's like 70% of the cells of our heart are made out of neurons. When you tell people,
Because you think brain when you think neuron.
yeah, but they're not limited to the brain. That neurons are on the brain, of course, but they're also in our heart tissue and in our digestive tract. Also contains neurons.
Those 3 energy centers.
Yeah. So you see, we actually have like 3 different forms of consciousness. We have intellectual self-awareness that happens through the brain. we have a sense of feeling, of knowing through feeling and heart-centeredness. And then we also have like gut feelings and
Yeah.
that drives our instincts. Okay, so we have these different areas where we have neurons. And then when we consume something like psilocybin, the crystalline structure of psilocybin is attaching to these neurons in these different places of our body, and therefore it is transforming the way that we perceive and experience energy. And again, everything that exists within reality is a form of energy, and we are energy perceiving, transforming, and processing beings. That's, like people have an idea of, well, like a being of energy. Like I'm thinking like a really old Star Trek episode, like old school Star Trek.
The guy
And
made of light.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's like all light, and it's like, oh, there's no physical form. No, everything that's physical is made out of energy. And so, we have sort of this fanciful idea of like, well, an energy being would be like this amorphous thing. But
Energy
no,
must mean ethereal, or yeah.
yeah, but that's not the way that it is. We are energy beings. This is what it looks like. Okay, is like us. And
Yeah.
so by altering the neurological makeup with the different neurotransmitters, that we're just able to perceive and process energy in a different way, and therefore a different kind of reality presents itself. And within that, kind of going back to where I started, it can actually enhance our perception of reality. And it can also, because we do have these very deep imaginative realms within consciousness, it can also, launch us into fantasy and visionary states where we're not necessarily perceiving things that exist outside in reality. But, anyone who's ever taken psilocybin mushrooms and gone out on a hike knows that you will see and perceive nature in a brand new way. And it's stunningly beautiful. That
Yeah.
what was dull and drab suddenly becomes full of light and texture and shades of color and resonance and feeling, and just everything becomes enhanced in a very beautiful and very powerful way.
Do you think with that kind of experience that you're actually seeing more of the true nature of the energy of the surrounding environment? That normally your system's kind of in that what people call the default mode network. You're shutting out a lot of those inputs. Do you think it kind of opens you up to suddenly experiencing a little more of this energetic world?
Yes, I do. And it
Yeah.
allows you to process the information in novel ways, which, you're looking at the same thing, but
Right.
you're looking at it in a different way. And it's often a very enriched way. Like, again, you could take like something really bland, like psilocybin mushrooms. Okay, you can look at a white wall, which normally just looks like a white wall, and then you take
Right.
some psilocybin mushrooms, and you will notice every shade and color, because the a lighting source in any given room is actually not uniform.
Right.
And so we look at a white wall, and our mind just says white wall, so we don't see anything there. But then when you look at a white wall in psilocybin, you notice actually it's a little darker over there, and then actually here's some subtle rainbow shades of light. And so
Yeah.
you're able to pick up on more nuanced energetic information. Now, again, the danger is that then you can also project onto that because it's interactive, so
Yeah.
that you're not just necessarily seeing things, but then you're projecting things onto there, and all of a sudden, well, there's a face in the wall, and the face is talking to me. Now, I'd say that's a projection.
Yeah.
Okay, so it does take a certain level of discrimination to learn how to tell the difference between what am I projecting versus what am I seeing, what am I experiencing versus what am I adding to that experience through my own particular filter.
When you talked about the crystals and the kind of the physiological reality of what's going on, it gets to another big theme in your work, which is that there are knowable tenets to how energy is expressed into form, and that's math and geometry.
Yeah.
And it's a really interesting way to think of math in geometric form, which I think all of us at one time or another have been fascinated by crystals. I've got tons of them, like everyone listening, by crystals, by fractals, by some of these forms and geometries that have such an innate kind of striking power to them. And so that idea that those then are these structures that energy kind of forms onto and creates things. So if you change those structures, math or geometry, and the forms that it creates, it changes how that energy expresses. So when you were talking about crystals attaching to neurons, in a way that's changing the geometry of some of those, physical cells or physical parts of your body. So yeah, that would then change the perception. So I just really like that part of the model too. It's kind of really grounded.
Yeah, that there is structure to reality. It's
Yeah.
not just chaotic energy. Like, lightning, for example. Lightning always forms into a fractal branch pattern, right? Lightning doesn't just go and it's not chaos, right? That there's structure and form to the way that that energy is expressed. And that, when we look out into nature, that we can see fractal structures across multiple levels of reality. A cloud has fractal structure to it. It looks like it's just chaos, but it's not. It has fractal structure to it. Mountain ranges have fractal structure. Rivers, have fractal structures. Coastlines have fractal structures. So we can see these fractal structures in inorganic reality. And also, apparently, some stars emit light in fractal patterns, which when I learned that, I thought that was pretty cool. There are disagreements within physicists about what is really the quantum level of reality, but some physicists believe that the variety of subatomic particles that we're able to observe or at least account for within quantum physics that actually are fractally related to each other. So we see these fractal structures, these geometric forms in inorganic reality, but then we also see it in organic reality. Whereas anytime you're looking at a tree, you're looking at a fractal. You're looking at a leaf, that's a fractal structure. You're looking at our nervous system inside our bodies, that is a fractal branch structure. Our vascular system, a fractal branch structure. Our heartbeat actually beats according to fractal patterns. That what we call heart rate variability is measured by fractal mathematics. There's even people looking at the micro movements of the musculature of our body as exhibiting fractal structures. And so what we have within fractals are repeating patterns that are nestled within each other across multiple levels simultaneously. And then what happens when you take enough psilocybin is that then you will start to see more of these fractal structures, and that you can, when you're looking out into the world, you can see them very clearly when you identify,
Right.
well, there's a tree, and look at all the geometry, and then you can see the geometry kind of exuding outside of it. And then if you close your eyes, that you'll see all this geometry and all these fractal forms. And the way that I understand it, the way that I think about it, is that, again, it's enhancing our ability to perceive this is how reality is structured. This is how thought, perception, energy, and the material world are all structured according to these patterns. And we just gain greater access, that there's an amplification of our senses that allows us to see that. And then also the way that we feel things is very much affected as well. And we feel these waves and these patterns, and then sometimes you can even just feel like these geometries like moving through your body. I mean, it's really fascinating, and it's also something that's very universal. I mean, it's not unique for somebody to say, oh yeah, I took some psilocybin mushrooms and it was just geometry and fractals everywhere. Well, that's the common thing if you take enough.
Getting back to that idea of connection again, that's another universal experience. So it seems like there are some fundamental experiences in psilocybin that everyone shares, and that's what I'm always struck by. As anyone who follows, my channels, the social media, all that good stuff. I don't get into psychedelics a lot, though I have tons of people ask me about it because it's one of the most exciting things for people about mushrooms. But I am always fascinated that there is this underlying commonality of experience that seems to be accessing some other realm, some other nature reality, like you just described. It is something that fascinates me, even if I'm not someone who discusses it a lot or partakes in it. It's undeniably amazing. And one question I had is, do you think that people, through taking psilocybin, obviously there's loads of psychedelics that you've kind of revealed, share this tryptamine structure that have a similar effect on our vehicle, the way we process it. Do you think taking these substances once indelibly changes that person, even just one time?
it's definitely within the realm of possibility.
Okay.
I mean, some people take psilocybin and they say, okay, well, that was a weird drug experience, whatever. But many people do feel that even one psychedelic experience was enough to really fundamentally change them
Yeah.
in some way or another. Now, I'm also of the opinion that if you're really curious about investigating all of this, that you're not going to get to the bottom of everything with just one experience. Because there's also a potential for transformation to take place. To go back to the idea of the ego, I like to describe the ego itself as just a collection of habituated patterns of energy, ways that we think, act, express ourselves, the way that we embody ourselves. It's all just these patterns that we've built up over time and then we've identified with. Here, again, it's not that the ego is bad, but that the ego can get in the way of us experiencing and expressing ourselves authentically. Where we get these inner critics and these inner judge that says, oh, you're not worthy, or you're stupid, or don't do
Right.
that, and then we get that from outside, from family and society and religion and politics, and everybody's telling us how to be and who to be, and then we have to conform to at least to some degree in order to fit in our society and to survive. And these are all functions of the ego. And so there's lots of ways that the ego can function in ways that ultimately are unhealthy for people. Now, even one powerful psychedelic experience gives you the opportunity of getting at least part way out of those patterns. And then you can start to see, oh, well, I was limiting myself, or I was attached to these ideas or these methods of expression. And
Yeah.
maybe the universe is more wonderful than I thought it was. And so that can be powerful, just to have one experience like that. But then to really deconstruct the ego and to open up energetic pathways for the more authentic expression of yourself, that's something that's a process and usually takes time. And so that's something that takes kind of ongoing dedicated work, when psychedelics can be an important part of that.
And that's something else that I was really struck by with your book, Mushroom Wisdom, is you talk about these practices, at least for you, as something that's not really recreational. I mean, as something that is work. You're catching a glimpse of these fractal patterns of the universe and getting these understandings of what we are as energy beings and the physiological realities of form and the universe that we inhabit. And then in order to really explore that, you have to go back and you have to, activate yourself to tune in again. And so it was thinking of psychedelics or taking mushrooms in that book as work. And that's something I don't think people often associate it with. I think that's getting more popularized now, but talk about that a little bit, just in how it's not just for fun.
Yeah. Well, I'd kind of start by saying that it certainly can be fun. There's nothing wrong with taking mushrooms and having fun, because they certainly can be fun. I mean, taking some mushrooms and going on a hike is fantastic. It's just beautiful. It's amazing. Or listening to your favorite music can be amazing. But if you want to go through this process, which I would describe as, if you really commit to it, that you really can liberate yourself from your self-imposed prison. And if you don't think you live in a self-imposed prison, then you probably don't know yourself well enough, because everybody does it. It's kind of the nature of the ego.
Right.
Again, not to say that it's bad, it's just the way that it functions. It's this normal function of the ego, is to create a self-identity. And that self-identity usually is limiting in some capacity. And there are aspects of people's self-identity that is not really authentic for them. So
Yes.
by looking at the consumption of psychedelics not as a form of entertainment, but as a form of energetic processing and work, meaning that there will be energies that arise that might be very uncomfortable. There might be things that arise where it really challenges your sense of self, challenges your beliefs, or you might be confronted by unconscious material that is scary or that is frightening. And that by allowing these energies, this is really the magic of it, is that the goal is surrender and get out of the way. And if you do that, and let the energy work on its own. There is an innate intelligence to the energy that can bring you into a more harmonious and liberated state. But that isn't something that happens just once, because the patterns of the ego are resilient and tenacious. And that's why, when we talk about the default mode network, that means the normal sets of associations and brain patterns that we have. And that's what our ego is functioning from. You take psilocybin, and suddenly new connections are being made, new associations, new ways of processing. And so you get out of the default mode network, but it's just a temporary suspension, because then as the psilocybin wears off and serotonin starts to reassert itself as the primary neurotransmitter, you go back into those patterns. And of course, as we all know from behaviors, anybody who has experienced, something in their life they felt that they were somehow responsible for, that you've probably experienced it many times, right? There are people say, God, why do I always get myself into this kind of situation? Why do I always do this to myself? Why do I, even though I know if I do this, I'm going to be unhappy, I still keep doing it. I keep doing it. And then, at the pathological level, that's where people get stuck in depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, things like that, where we keep falling back into the same patterns again.
Detrimental
and again.
patterns, yeah.
Exactly. That to unwind those takes time.
Yeah.
Right? Now, with psychedelics, you have an accelerated methodology. I mean, you can go to therapy and you can talk to a therapist and you can spend 10 years talking to a therapist, or you can sit down and do a few sessions with psilocybin mushrooms and you can actually make a lot more progress much more quickly. But it has to be done with the intention of, I'm doing this so that I can have this energetic experience. And that means I'm not engaging in normal social interaction. I'm not just going out for a hike, but I'm actually using this as an opportunity to surrender and to open up, to see what arises, and then to allow that to process through. And then when people really are letting things process through, what that looks like is that then people might be making all kinds of sounds. People can cry, people can tone, people can speak in glossolalia. Then there can also be different forms of purging that take place, where people are throwing up or where people are gagging energetically. Because, we hold on to these patterns inside ourselves. And as they come out, it's like, oh God, and I feel so much better. And there can also be diarrhea. People can have full body orgasms. I mean, there's just all different ways that the energy can then process through, but it takes dedication, because even with very powerful psychedelics, the ego can still get in the way, because the ego says, oh my God, I'm freaking out, I'm dying, I'm losing my mind, this is too scary, make it stop, how do I distract myself? Versus saying, look, I'm going to let myself be subject to this experience, and I'm going to see it all the way through so that the energy reaches a point of completion. Especially when you're dealing with high-level psychedelics, this is really one of the major dangers, is that because it can be unsettling, it can be scary, then the ego gets in the way, and then it short circuits the process, and then you have lingering after effects that can actually last for years for individuals, because their ego got in the way of the process. And I like to tell people that, if you're really going to do this work, you're going to be opening up Pandora's box, and you can't just put that stuff back in. Okay.
Yeah.
Where you get like what I call Humpty Dumpty syndrome, where you've completely shattered your ego and then you have no idea how to put it back together and you don't know how to function. There are pitfalls, there are dangers. And that's why I spend a lot of time educating people about how to do this in a really fruitful way. And then I also offer consultation services with people who are having a tough time integrating their experience. So there's lots of potential, but there's also, with any kind of tool that's powerful, there's also the potential to do damage.
Absolutely.
As well as create something beautiful.
Well, absolutely. And you're playing with energy systems. And this is something else I read in your book. These systems aren't subtle. We think of some of these, when the energy is going through my body, we think of it as this very subtle thing that you might not know is happening. I mean, you're describing, once you're heaving up your insides, it's not a subtle experience anymore. That's the energy working. And that's like the powerful kind of energetic shift, I think, that when you're doing this as work, you're trying to achieve. And integration is such a big thing that people are talking about now. When I get into these topics, it's that concept of like afterwards, you need to take certain steps to make sure that, as your ego brings back together your individuated self, that you're doing that in a productive way where you're still taking away some of those bigger kind of unitary consciousness insights that you brought back, not losing all that, but then being able to function in a society of other individuated egos. So I guess, do you have any advice for people going through the experience? Is it as simple as letting that energy rise and run through you, just keeping the ego out of the way? Like the psychedelic experience, the remapping that occurs, you don't need to consciously think, no, I want my neuron to go that way. I mean, it does that energetic shift in the best way for you if you get out of the way. Is that the general kind of
That's the
idea?
general idea, but
Yeah.
there's actually even something else that people can do that I have found is one of the most fundamental keys. And it's this: the energies and patterns of the ego almost always express themselves asymmetrically within either our thinking or within our bodies, right? So the ego divides things into right, wrong, good, bad, yes, no, this, that, right? So it's constantly parceling things out to either one category or another. So it does that at an internal level. And then at the external level, the ego almost always functions asymmetrically, that it expresses things, like if somebody, gets uncomfortable with something, what are they going to do? Oh, it's like, they're going to cross their arms to protect themselves.
Yeah.
Or if somebody's uncomfortable looking at you, then they'll want to look away, right? And so rather than, okay, I'm just going to be here and I'm going to absorb this, that these asymmetries show up, or people fiddle more with their left hand than with their right hand, or they shake their left leg when they get nervous, or their right leg, right? There's all these different ways that these asymmetries show up. So what happens when you take a psychedelic and you're kind of amplifying your experience of energy, this can then aggravate the ego. So for example, someone's sitting there and they're having a great time, but all of a sudden they get uncomfortable and they're just like, they start looking around and they start moving and they start fidgeting, and it's like, okay, you drink some water, okay, that's good. Oh wait, no, change the music. Maybe I'll text my friends, let them know, wow, I'm really having a big thing going on right now. And so one of the keys to really allowing this energetic formatting to take place, because the opposite end of this is that when people energetically go all the way into a non-dual experience where they completely transcend this apparent divide between subject and object, self and other, what happens is their bodies open up with this nice bilateral symmetry. It's kind of like they're embracing all of reality. There's just this big like yes that opens up. And then people's bodies can also move. This is something that happens really particularly with 5-MeO DMT, because it's the most energetically powerful, but it can show up in other places as well. People's bodies open up and then they start moving with this bilateral symmetry where the left and right sides of their body always mirror each other. But the difference between these kinds of movements is that most movements that we engage in are through the ego, because it's relation to subject to object, right?
Yeah.
And even when we're talking to each other, it's like I'm expressing a point to you, so I'm gesticulating with my left hand, right? And so there's always these subject-object relationships, that our movements are designed to accomplish something in the relationship between subject and object, subject and world, self and other. But these movements, these bilaterally symmetrical movements that take place in these non-dual energetic states, they are purely expressive of the energy. There is no object. There's no subject-object relationship. It's just someone expressing what's happening to them energetically. One of the guidelines that I articulate with people is that if you want to go all the way and transcend the ego, working with entheogens, that means you should use bilateral symmetry in the body, and then become aware, especially as things become uncomfortable, how you're almost immediately drawn to be asymmetrical. So like you're sitting there and all of a sudden, oh crap, think that thought, and then we start expressing and we start moving. And so by using bilateral symmetry in the body, you're actually able to more easily bypass the default mode network and the normal structures of the ego and its energetic patterns. And that then you can also become aware of where you are drawn to be asymmetrical, and then become aware of how that's an expression of certain choices and beliefs that you've had. So it's a way of deconstructing yourself. And then the energy is able to flow freely through your being. And that's where it finds the places where you're stuck, and all of a sudden, blah, you're throwing out all that self-hatred that you've been harboring for years, and it feels fantastic. But you can't force that out. You can't be like, well, I know that I hate myself, so I want to get all of it out so that I can love myself. No, you surrender, you submit, you relax into symmetry, and then when it comes, you don't resist it, and you invite it. You say, okay, you can come on out now, and then blah, it all comes out, and then you feel clean. But then afterwards, then it's about personal responsibility, that you have to choose not just to fall back into your old patterns, and to become more self-aware, more self-conscious, and learn to tell the difference between who you think you should be and what you think you should do versus what you actually feel, and then operating from that place of self-awareness, of feeling that you're doing what feels true to you, not because you think you should, or that you have to, or that it's expected or required of you to achieve any kind of particular outcome. So it's a personal responsibility for the embodiment of authentic energy. And that's where psychedelics are a very, very powerful tool to help people learn what that really means. So it's not just an idea, it's a lived reality.
Yeah, that's what I'm struck by so much, is it's a lived, the somatic element of the therapy that you talk about, and some of your talks on YouTube, that kind of thing, was really powerful because it adds this element of tangible practice. That's something that is something you're really manipulating. Because whenever you talk about energy, whenever you talk even about consciousness, like I said before, we have the sense of the ethereal, and it's something we can't really touch or manipulate. And you're saying, no, like energy flows through your body, through your physiology, which you can manipulate by moving. And I don't know, it's very empowering almost the way you talk about it, because it gives us a lot more control over these things like energy that we think we don't have any control over, even that feeling of, that self-hatred or whatever, these things that get stuck in our body or in our identity somewhere.
Yeah.
Giving you the power to actually do something about it, not just talk about it, but like do something. So yeah, I really love that part of your work. I always want to give the caveat that, this isn't a blanket call for people to go out and immediately do psychedelics, but it is a really inspiring, good guideline for people to know there is a practice here. Look at it more of as a therapeutic practice, and really take the time, get to know yourself first, and kind of check in with where you're at before you just dive right in, and then have some tools and some things you can do during the experience.
Yeah, and that there are very practical methodologies and techniques that you can use. And here is where my work is really unique. I mean, now people are more understanding this difference between bilateral symmetry and asymmetries in the way that energy functions, particularly because 5-MeO-DMT is much more popular now than when I first started talking about all of this, like back in 2008 and 2009. But I was the first person to really identify that this bilateral symmetry is a real thing. And these asymmetries, this is also a real thing. And if you pay attention to it, I mean, and I even tell people, like, go watch videos that people have posted online of them tripping. And when you see people moving with asymmetry, you can see them in their ego. And then when you see them moving with bilateral symmetry, you're actually seeing them outside of their ego. And you can start to make these really clear distinctions. And then you can see the ways that egos avoid, the way that they fight, the way that they indulge, the way that they make believe, the way that they make meaning, the way they make purpose. I mean, it becomes a way of reading not only your own energy, but the energy of other people as well. It's a way of looking at and appreciating the natural structures of reality and how to maximize them to your benefit. And then that makes integration so much easier, because it also puts the emphasis on the energetic process itself. Whereas, a lot of people with psychedelics, they get into a very mind-centered thing, like, well, I'm looking for downloads and I'm looking for insights. And I'm saying it's not really about that. It's about how are you embodying and processing your energy. And insights will come with that.
Yeah.
But just having an insight in and of itself is meaningless unless you're able to actually embody it and live it.
That's a really important distinction, is you want the energy to be functioning appropriately in your body, and then you can actually make use of any insights that may be generated from that experience or just from yourself. They become
Yeah.
more useful if your energetic system is functioning correctly. Now, I know you've studied a lot of indigenous cultures and studied really the history of entheogenic use in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And do you find any commonalities with the method that you've derived of bilateral symmetry and, this step-by-step process of energetic purification almost? Do you find that also in indigenous cultures? Is this kind of the science of psychedelics that had been derived even before Martin was able to demystify it for us?
Yeah. The closest that I can find is in the ancient Hindu tradition, even before it was identified as being Hindu. The religious scriptures of the Rig Veda are all about entheogen use. It's all about the consumption of psychedelics. And according to the stories, that people were working with psychedelics and that they were exhibiting these spontaneous bilateral symmetrical movements.
Wow.
And that from this is where the yogic tradition developed, which is not bilaterally symmetrical, right? Yoga is all about these predefined poses, and a lot of them have asymmetries in them. But the roots of it were these spontaneous activations of energy in the body, facilitated through psychedelic use. Over time, all of that got symbolized and mythologized and ritualized and formalized to where, most people within Hinduism today don't even realize that the roots of their religion go back to psychedelic usage. There are elements of this, but I think just the clear distinction that non-dual universal energy, when actually embodied in not just a mental event, is something that occurs with bilateral symmetry in the body. I think that I'm the first person to really definitively articulate that. And because most religions do have some kind of root in psychedelic use, but over time, like I said, that they get formalized, mythologized, ritualized, symbolized. Most of the meditation traditions have now adopted this idea of the lotus posture where you're crossing your legs, and that they describe enlightenment as like this mental breakthrough. But they don't talk about it in terms of energizing the body. They talk about it in terms of enlightenment is what allows you to escape physical reality and reach into the etheric realms. And so I think that they've actually divorced it from the physicality of being, even in many of the monastic meditative traditions that have developed, that really they're divorced from life and reality as a human being, right? The whole idea is that you go join the monastery or the ashram, and then you become celibate for the rest of your life, and you don't engage in any kind of normal social human interactions, and you don't have a family or things like that. So it's become very elitist, whereas psychedelics make these levels of awareness, and I would say even deeper levels of awareness than are available just through meditation. It makes it available really to everyone in potential, because you don't have to go spend your life sitting on a cushion.
And the ultimate goal isn't to just evaporate into the air and become nothingness.
Yeah.
It's that idea, and that's what I was curious about in talking to you, is if you see, this idea of everything is energy, everything is one. A lot of people then take that to a degree of, well, then form doesn't matter, or what we're doing here doesn't matter because we're really energetic beings. And the way that I see with your model now is kind of, well, form is really just really condensed energy in certain frequencies. So we can't dismiss form because that's just energy. So there's a reason, the unitary consciousness that is everything and is putting out this latent energy that we are formed from. There's kind of an intention, whether or not it's like a conscious intention we would be able to conceive. There's an intention to have form in these higher levels of energy.
Yeah, because this is how the unitary being is able to experience and explore itself.
Yeah.
Is through what we call reality. Many of the mystical traditions they dismiss reality and they say, well, it's an illusion. Like in
Yeah.
Buddhism and Hinduism, Jainism, they say, oh, all of this is Maya. This is
Maya.
all just
Yeah.
an illusion. None of it really matters because we're just trying to transcend and reach this nothingness point.
Right.
And so there's kind of a dismissal of the physical world, and yeah, just to call it an illusion. And my response to that is, well, it may be an illusion, but it's still reality. That you know
Yeah.
it's a game that God is playing with itself, but that doesn't invalidate the game. What I like to say is the game is the thing. It's the human ego that says, oh, well, I'm a spiritual being on a quest to reach enlightenment so that I can completely transcend reality. Whereas the God perspective is, man, I've been spending billions of years just to reach this point so that we can all be here and then interact with each other. That this is what God is doing. I call it the reality project. This is what it looks like when God is being itself. And it's only the human ego that says, my highest goal is to transcend and get out of this damn thing. Whereas God is like, I've invested everything into being this thing, and you silly humans are just trying to get out. And by doing that, you're actually trying to remove yourself from biological life.
Whereas transcendence to that unitary consciousness is more about seeing the underlying structures of this thing. That's transcendence, or at least my idea of it from what you're talking about. And the psychedelic experience is one way to get you there, is this more clearer understanding of the true nature of reality. But that's really the transcendence, is understanding the formed world to like this incredibly high level to where you're almost above it and can objectively see it and be aware of it all.
Yeah. And also within that is then the all important self recognition, the recognition that, oh, that's me. I
Yeah.
am seeing myself. I am experiencing myself. And I don't mean the egoic self, but the fundamental sense of I am. And when you see all these infinite fractal structures stretching out across all space and time and looking at that and realizing, that's me. I am this. This is the nature of being. I am that. And that means I also am this moment. I am the computer. I am the person that I'm talking to. I am also myself as this person, right? That is the true nature of the self. That allows us then to interact with the rest of reality in a very different way, where it's not just it's me against the world, but it's
Right.
actually, we actually really are all one. How I treat other people is a reflection of how I treat myself. The permissions that I give to other people is a reflection of the permissions that I give myself. My willingness to love myself is a reflection of my ability to love others. All of this, it really deeply transforms that sense of being in the world and what it means to be a human being. Again, this is a place where people say, oh, you're just going back to that Judeo-Christian thing, but I really do think that human beings are fundamentally special, that we are the most sophisticated reality enjoyment vehicles that exist for God to experience and perceive itself in and through. And therefore, we have a great deal of responsibility to get to know who and what we are, and then behave authentically and responsibly from that place. And that's both the burden and the gift of being a human being, that we have the ability to actually know that we are God. And sometimes that's really freaky for the ego when it encounters
Yeah.
that. It's like, oh my God, that's too much responsibility. I can't take that, right?
Right.
But the joy is that, well, God is actually responsible for itself in all of its separate and myriad forms. So only my responsibility begins and ends right here with this vehicle. For you, it's you. For the dog, it's the dog. For the glass of water, it's being the glass of water. And everything else in reality is itself naturally and effortlessly. It's only human beings who have this self-awareness that gives us the ability to confuse ourselves as to what does it mean to actually be ourselves and to be authentic and be true, and then also be responsive.
And this worldview also inculcates this sense of morality, this idea of traditional spirituality where people are trying to get connected to something higher than themselves. I don't think there's any more empowering field of connection than to look out across the expanse of fractal geometry and say, I am all of this. It kind of brings with it all of these things that we know are so important. And it was actually one of my questions is, what does this mean about morality? And I think you answered it beautifully. If we're all one, then you would immediately start treating everyone and everything like you would want to be treated. It brings with it naturally in this understanding, kind of compacts all these really important factors in there. But what does this all mean about spirit and soul? Because so many of us imagine that we have this overlaid blue glowing body that's within this meat suit that's just waiting to escape when we pass over. So what does that mean about spirit and soul?
Yeah, well, for me, this is one of the places where I found through my own experience that I just fundamentally disagreed with the vast majority of spiritual and religious traditions that posit that we have some kind of essential essence that makes you you, and some essence that makes me me. That it is just a recognition. I think I already said this, that there's only one actor, but there's billions of characters, and
Mm.
so the fundamental me is identical to the fundamental you. So that means I do not have a unique soul or spirit that animates me, that it's one living thing that is animating everyone and everything. And so there aren't individualized souls, there aren't individualized spirits, which also, for me, that means I don't believe in reincarnation, because that to me just seems like a projection of the ego that says, well, some individuated sense of self reincarnates across
I want to
multiple
make sure I come
lifetimes.
back.
Yeah, yeah, I, whatever, wherever that is, that's me. And
Yeah.
this also became for me a really big problem with Buddhism, where Buddhism teaches that there is no soul and there is no self. And so then the next conclusion should be, well, then there's no reincarnation, but Buddhism teaches reincarnation. But Buddhism contrasted itself with Hinduism, which says that there is a soul and there's reincarnation. And then Buddha came along and said, well, guess what? There is no soul and there's no creator God, but there's still reincarnation. That for me is like a major intellectual problem for Buddhism. And then we have the Western Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions that say we all have a unique individual soul, only human beings have it, and
Mm.
that after your life on earth, you either go to paradise or you go to the place of punishment. And that also is clearly, it's just a projection of the ego. It's just a construct. It's just a belief system. So no, nobody has a soul. There are no souls. Just don't exist. There's only one living thing that is everything. In a sense, it's really, 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 really simple.
Yeah.
It's the egoic human mind that wants to complicate it, because then by complicating it, it says, oh, now I have a purpose. Now I have a meaning. I have to go to heaven and avoid hell, or I have to be a good Hindu or a good Buddhist, or I have to avoid karma. I have to reach enlightenment. I have to cultivate the clear light awareness within myself, right? It gives us a sense of purpose and meaning. And that's simply an addiction of the human ego, of
Yeah.
wanting things to mean something, of wanting there to be a purpose. Whereas the only purpose of life is to live and to be. I mean, that's just it. Because that's all that God is doing. What is God doing? God is being itself. So then what's our job? Be yourself.
It seems like, as part and parcel of this whole worldview, I mean, maybe not reincarnation in those senses you just broke down, but the fact that there's this infinite pool of animating consciousness and energy present in all things that creates all things. Yeah, we reincarnate, but it's not you, quote unquote. It's just that same force creating another
Yeah.
form. I guess what I want to say is it's a worldview that seems to encompass so many different aspects that we've separated in modern religions or just modern cultural systems. We've separated all these ideas and tried to examine each one. And this kind of unifies them. And I think hence why you call it a unifying theory. I think it
Yeah.
really brings all this stuff together in a way that makes a lot of sense. But, I may not actually know that. I may not have that knowing unless I experience it.
Yeah, and that's really one of the fundamental keys. That's one of the gifts of psychedelics, is that it allows you to enter into a place of knowing where it's not just, yeah, I agree with this, or I think this is correct, or I think this is true. But if you follow the methodologies, if you really go all the way, this is what people come back with, and they say, wow, I guess you were just telling the truth. And also, a common comment that I get from people is, you just told me what I already knew. I just didn't know that I knew it. And then
Yeah.
on the other side of that, I also do piss a lot of people off, because I do challenge standard religious and spiritual conceptions and metaphysics and beliefs and things like that. And I've also had people who tell me that, when they first encountered my ideas, that they were just furious and angry and I can't believe this
Who do
guy.
you think you are? Yeah.
Yeah, and then they have their experience, and I've gotten letters of apology from people who never insulted me in the first place, but they were just doing it privately to themselves. This damn guy Martin. And
Sorry,
then
I hated you.
yeah, and I get these emails sometimes like, I hated you so much I threw your book across the room. But then I had this experience and I realized, oh my God, he was just telling me as clearly as he could, as plainly as he could. And it's like, well, yeah, because I really do think this is it.
Yeah.
And it's not to be egotistical about it. It's not to say, oh yeah, pat myself on the back, but it's just, look, I myself have found clarity on these issues, and I've done what I can to share that clarity with others. And I do think that the potential is universal, that I think for anyone who really goes all the way into the experience of the self, they can reach the same conclusions. That I don't think that there's anything fundamentally unique there.
Kind of struck by how not egotistical it is, and that you're saying, I am the same as all of you, and my spirit, I don't even have a spirit. It's not unique. It's kind of one of the least egotistical worldviews that I've heard in a while. And just to center this on psilocybin for a minute, on psilocybin-containing mushrooms, in this spectrum of psychedelics, are all the experiences largely the same, that you come to this same kind of knowing, or what might be different, and specifically what's different about psilocybin and kind of where it takes you and tuning into these energetic truths about reality?
So psilocybin mushrooms, they can be very physical in terms of their energetic interface with the human being, meaning that you can feel lots of energies like moving through your body and across your body, like especially on the surface. People can get these shivers or sensations of ice, or you can get little tingles and pinpricks and they kind of move around. You can also get different levels of vibrations in different parts of the body, particularly places where there has been tension or where you're holding something, that it might start to vibrate, it might start to move. Also, energetically, when psilocybin mushrooms first come on, actually what they're doing is they're changing your brainwave patterns more into a sleeping or dreaming brainwave pattern. So it's very common for, as mushrooms are coming on, people get sort of a sense of chills, and then they also feel dreamy and kind of sleepy, at least initially. Kind of get this feeling like, oh, well, I just want to lie down and, just close my eyes. And then later on in the experience, you might feel more physically energized, but the come on can kind of have this, I'm slipping into a dream, or I'm going into sort of a more restful state. It doesn't work this way for everyone. I mean, this is what I always tell people about any kind of psychedelics, is that results always vary.
Right.
And that it's dependent on the individual, on the dose, on the setting, where they are, where they're at, what they're thinking and feeling at that time period. But for many people, not everyone, for many people, psilocybin mushrooms can be very, very strongly visual. But it's interesting because not everyone. Sometimes people say, well, yeah, I had 5 grams of mushrooms and I saw nothing. But I felt lots of stuff. Overall, what it does is it can either in a very subtle way or in a very dramatic way, depending on the dose and how you're processing it, can really change your sense of perception of what you feel and what you think and what you see. So it can affect all these things, so that you think in different ways, that you make associations in ways that you weren't making before. And visually, it can be very active, both with eyes open and with eyes closed. And you could have one set of visual phenomenon happening with eyes open and something completely different with closed eyes, or it can actually be identical. It doesn't matter if your eyes are open or closed. And certainly, as there's different emotional experiences, people can experience their heart rate going up or their heart rate going down. You can experience where you feel like you're not breathing at all, but you're actually just breathing just very, very slowly. So there's lots of different ways that it presents itself. And, when you're familiar with it, it's also very distinctly psilocybin mushrooms. And then it also produces physiological things, like for a lot of people can produce gas and burping. You can definitely get like mushroom mouth. And it's also really common for people to get kind of clammy on their skin and on their hands. which that can accentuate the feeling of having the chills. And so you might want to be wrapped up in a blanket or something like that. But overall, every psychedelic has its own particular presentation and signature. And once you
Wow.
get to know them, you could take like a mystery substance. If you're familiar enough with it, then you know, oh, that's this. And
Yeah,
that
yeah.
Psilocybin as a tryptamine clearly fits within the tryptamine family. There's a particular kind of fractal geometric structure to tryptamines, which is different from phenethylamines and you know, other kinds of psychedelics. And so that even though like 5-MeO-DMT is radically different from psilocybin, there's still that sense of, oh yeah, this is in the tryptamine family. I can tell that these are cousins to each other
Hmm.
in a way, especially with the tryptamines, because our neurological system tends to function on tryptamines. There often is a sense that people get of, oh, I recognize this. I'm somehow at home at this experience, even though it's very different and very unusual, that there's a sense of being at home. Like this is very natural to the human being. You know, then of course, as I've already mentioned, the human body produces both DMT and 5-MeO-DMT,
Right, right.
and can produce these things in excess as well. So people can have these spontaneous psychedelic experiences as well.
Yeah, so it is in a way, it is kind of a coming home. And I was curious because I know in your book you talk about mushrooms as kind of teachers of self and knowledge of self and seeing the world less as a machine world. And it sounds like that kind of experience, those kind of knowings are present across the tryptamine family.
Yeah.
It was your first venture into entheogens with psilocybin containing mushrooms, and then did you grow from there? I guess a little bit of kind of how you first got into this world, because now you're kind of the way shower bringing back all this information. How did you first get into this world?
Back in college, it was between my first and second years of college that I had my first psilocybin experience. And that was largely inspired just by friends and people who knew me and knew what I was interested in, that, you know, people kept telling me like, oh, Martin, you really should try some psilocybin mushrooms. You know, we think you'll like them. And so that kind of what got me into it. And at that point, I was kind of a self-identified Zen Buddhist. That was kind of my adopted spiritual background at the
Right.
time. And I'd already been, you know, using cannabis. Back in high school, I decided that cannabis was great because I felt inspired and creative and insightful when I smoked cannabis. But when I drank alcohol, I felt dulled and numb and stupid. And I decided that I didn't like alcohol at all, but I really did like cannabis. And so then, you know, jumping off into mushrooms. And at the time, I was one of those people that was like, oh, yeah, it comes from the earth. So it's natural and it's good, you know, that I really liked that mushrooms were, you know, a natural psychedelic. Also, you know, I would say, you know, historically, that probably psilocybin mushrooms are like the first psychedelics in the sense that, you know, you don't have to smoke them, you don't have to prepare them, that human beings, you know, as they were going around foraging, that you just pick up a mushroom and eat it and you get this effect from it, versus
Right.
cannabis is something you have to learn how to cultivate and you have to dry it and you have to smoke it, you know, so that was probably something developmentally that came later. And then cannabis became the first cultivated crop among human beings across several different human cultures.
I
You
didn't
know,
know
because
that. I mean, I
yeah,
guess that makes sense.
people wanted to get high. Cannabis is one of the very first cultivated crops, obviously of immense value to prehistoric humans. And archaeologists have now found grave sites with lots of cannabis, you know, marijuana flowers are there in the grave. And this stretches everywhere from Europe to Asia.
It
You
makes
know,
sense when we think about animals sometimes that are consuming psychedelic substances like koalas. There are different birds that becomes their whole driving force. So that kind of makes sense. You know, once we as animal beings in these experience vehicles discover something like that, we latch onto that.
yeah, even bees, that they've done studies that show that bees, when given the choice to pollinate between a psychoactive plant versus a non-psychoactive plant, that they definitely prefer pollinating a psychoactive plant.
That might explain their proliferation.
Yeah, that they go to that more than they will to other plants. But yeah, then from psilocybin mushrooms, I got into Salvia divinorum, which is just a
Mm.
completely different, really radically unique psychedelic experience. And then it was after that that I first got introduced to 5-MeO DMT via yopo seeds, which was not very particularly effective for me. And then I got introduced to it through toad secretions, but that was a very small dose, so it didn't really do much of anything. And then I got introduced to 5-MeO DMT through the pure free race molecule, and that was the one that just like, oh my God, it's God. This is it. This is the experience I've been looking for my entire life that I had no idea I was looking for. That was back in early 2008, and since then I have explored all different kinds of synthetic tryptamines and molecules and phenethylamines, and also peyote and San Pedro and ayahuasca and quote unquote regular DMT. Yeah, pretty much I'm one of those people that, if something new comes across and someone offers it to me, I was like, yeah, I'll give it a try. I'm curious, because I'm very interested in that they all have their own unique presentation.
Yeah.
And for me, that's kind of fun to learn, like, what is this new molecule? And I'm able to learn them pretty quickly, that usually after one experience with a molecule that I feel like I have an intimate sense of kind of, oh, this is how it works.
And as I talk to people, it seems more and more like this is almost like a scientific exploration for folks, exploring the nature of reality that we're not privy to. We're just in our normal ego-identified day-to-day consciousness, and also exploring the inner parts of themselves, how energy works in their body. More and more as I talk to people, it does sound like a lot of it's unknown. And, right now we are experiencing kind of a psychedelic renaissance, I think, in a lot of ways, at least in this country, but I think really around the world.
Yeah, it's really around the world. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess, what do you make of that? Is this inevitable? Are psychedelics destined to be the unifying factor of human culture and the human experience, where eventually it will be required eating for these experience vessels and will be a better place for it? Or what's your take on the eventual kind of outcome of this current renaissance?
I think that we are at a very special time in history, that way back in the old days when we all lived in small tribal nomadic cultures, the dominant form of spirituality was shamanism, and shamanism
Right.
Widely makes use of psychedelics. But even there, it was still kind of an elite group. It was the shamans mostly who were taking the psychedelics. And then we have the development of the historical religious traditions, the large scale religious traditions, and they all have roots within psychedelics. But then a lot of that got lost over time. Some of it was preserved among elite, secret, underground, initiated groups of people. But we now live in a time, well, then we went through the war on drugs, which was just total BS.
Yeah. I think everyone knows that.
Just completely misguided. And we now are living at a time where we're able to scientifically understand the actions of psychedelics, and we have a much richer knowledge of their historical and traditional use within cultures and religions and spiritual traditions. And we also are living at a time where the limitations of the human ego are really confrontational, in the sense of, we have widespread environmental crises, we have widespread political and religious ideologies, crises, and conflicts. Especially among younger people, they just don't believe in the old religions anymore. They just don't. It's like, no, I don't buy it, because what I see is a lot of hypocrisy. I see a lot of hate. I see a lot of people fighting against each other. I see a lot of abuse of the environment. I see the degradation of women, or people of the wrong race, or people of the wrong ethnicity. So people are really turned off from traditional religions and spiritualities, but there's still a desire for experience and for growth and for knowledge. And now that we have the scientific understanding that psychedelics are really relatively safe at the physiological level, they also hold great potential to enhance creativity, to cultivate spiritually meaningful experiences for people. You don't have to believe anything. You don't have to buy into anybody's dogma. You don't have to sign up to anybody's church or group. So they're kind of a great equalizer, and that we are at a point in history where now this knowledge is just undeniable. I mean, the cat's out of the bag, metaphorically speaking. And, so here in Oregon, we now, coming up in November, we have the opportunity to vote to legalize psilocybin-assisted therapy here in Oregon. And also there is a bill to decriminalize all drugs in Oregon.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So Oregon is looking to potentially make world history here. We already have here in Oregon legal access to ayahuasca through the Santo Daime Church. There's also legal access to peyote through the Native American Church, but this is going to expand it even more. So I call all politics, culture, religion, and identity, I call all of those meta-egos, meaning that they are egoic structures that are shared by multiple individuals.
Sure.
People have become disaffected from these meta-egos. They're not working anymore. Like when we all lived in small tribal societies, we had to have a cohesive sense of group identity. But then as those expanded into empires and religions, that formed war and conquering and slavery. And also many of the traditional religions are just strongly patriarchal, where they're really dismissive of women and women's experiences. Again, that psychedelics are these great equalizers, that we don't have to be a member of any of these groups. Really, people are looking for authenticity, that we're sick of the BS of politics, culture, religion, identity. We're sick of it. And we're looking for what's authentic and what's real. And we're at a place where if we don't get to that, we really have the potential to do massive environmental damage as well as social and cultural damage. And I mean, it's already happening. It's happening right now. And so we're at a place where we need help as human beings to get ourselves out of the mess that we put ourselves in. And psychedelics are a potential route for doing that. They're a fundamental tool that humans have at their disposal. And it's just, the time seems right.
And invariably, people who have gone down this path, whether it's not as deep an exploration as you've done into entheogens, but people who have gone down the path are some of the most conscientious, aware, nicest people that I know. I think there's this one projection of people who are into psychedelics as being out of touch. But I think the more and more that's getting dispelled and people are realizing that it's actually dropping people more into themselves. People are really comfortable. They're really aware. They're, like I said, they're really conscientious. And I see it as like this kind of evolution. And one of my questions was going to be, does our emerging relationship with psychedelics, more and more people becoming aware of them, more and more people like yourself deriving techniques for responsible and productive use, kind of mapping the science of psychedelics and how to use them with this vehicle, does that necessitate just a total overhaul, maybe however you want to say it? I don't know if it's an evolution, a recreation, but just new models of human organization and how we exist on the planet. This idea of governments where people who feel really important dress up in suits and go in a big imposing building. Maybe we don't want to do that anymore. Maybe it's, instead of that, it'll be, some kind of open air temple or sacred space. Does it kind of throw all of these models that we're so used to into question because they aren't serving us anymore?
Absolutely, because all of these models are based on egoic projections and ideals. And if we can all collectively and individually start to transcend these and find more authentic modes of expression, that it does mean that the potential future psychedelic society will not look anything like society currently looks like. I mean, when we live in these capitalist models of everybody's got to earn a living, you have to pay to be alive, and just these absurd political left-right models. It's all us versus them, and so much of it is based on fear and projection, that as we start to move beyond these things, that human society will organically transform itself into something far more sustainable, far more compassionate, so much of our society is based on what we think of as the other, whether it's based on sex, gender, ethnicity, religion, skin color, hairstyle. We develop so much around our fears about the other, what we need to do to protect ourselves from them or stop them or whatever, that psychedelics help all of that stuff actually just evaporate.
Yeah.
Where it's not just a feel-good statement. It's like, my God, we really are all one. So what are we doing to ourselves? What are we doing to each other? And doing to the planet and everything else here?
And I think that's why that personal responsibility component you brought up is so important, to have all these realizations and remembrances of, yeah, we are all one. We all came from the same. And then have the personal responsibility to then act accordingly. I think that's the next level of really implementing like psychedelic culture, if you will, is to suddenly take all those realities that you know are to be true and implement them in your day-to-day life. And I can't help but think that'll make a massive change. And from talking to you, it doesn't sound like everyone's going to need to be tripping on psychedelic substances all the time to bring this new society into being. It's just using them as a tool to do that work on ourselves will create a society that lets us transcend so many of the ego-derived ills that we see in today's society that really leave us feeling like there's no hope. And that's one other thing that sticks out to me so much when I talk to people about psychedelics, really about mushrooms and fungi in general with their massive potential. Really, yeah, we can change things, and here's how. So
Yeah.
it's really exciting.
Yeah, because people have experienced that at the personal level. My life changed when I started working with psilocybin mushrooms, but a real fundamental change was when I started working with 5-MeO DMT, and I became a different person
Mm,
in a fundamental sense, that I had been holding myself back, and I wasn't even aware of ways that I had been holding myself back. And it gave me the vehicle through which to create a really radical personal transformation. And, just at the therapeutic level, that if we look at human history, so much of it is just steeped in trauma. Like in the United States, we have a country that has a radically unequal economic system that is based on the exploitation of mass numbers of people and keeping them in relative poverty, that has also been based on genocide of Native Americans and their continued subjugation, and on slavery and racism, which is perpetuated through the police state against minorities and people of color, that there are generations of trauma. And, the ego compensates for that. Rather than compensating for that, we actually have an opportunity to experience it fully, release it, and transform it. And that's what psychedelics can help make possible. And so if this can be incorporated into society in a good way, it holds the potential for healing to take place. That the history of human interactions have been one of war and conquest and subjugation and domination.
yeah.
And the psychedelic model is more of healing, cooperation, and transformation. And that it's also very inspiring. I mean, people who take psychedelics, they make really amazing art and really amazing music and write really amazing books. It actually inspires people to do something different and to take these potentials that they perceive in the psychedelic state and then bring it into reality and to create. So that it's just very, very inspirational. And the well of potential creativity, I mean, what you learn with psychedelics really quickly as soon as you go deep is that, man, it's just endless. It's infinite. The well from which we can draw is infinite, that we don't need to be limited by our history and by our identities and by our patterns, that we can completely transform that. And it's one individual at a time, but it's also, we're at the stage where now it's happening at the societal level as well. Like, again, here in Oregon, we get to vote on whether we want to legalize psilocybin-assisted therapy. So that's a structural change that can be made. Yes. And that then once more people are having those experiences, then other structures of society will start to change as well.
It's a natural process that, to me, it seems like we don't need to worry about it too much. Like it's happening, and I don't want to invoke other thinkers, because I think all of your work, from what I'm reading, comes from your own experience. But in reading Food of the Gods by Terence McKenna, he said it's inevitable. the society will be pervaded by psychedelics and will be the number one thing that everyone has in common eventually. And I very much see us on that path, and with more people deriving responsible use and techniques, and there's just such a huge future. Well, I guess for you, what is some of the work you're doing in Oregon, maybe a little bit of future plans before we wrap up? If there's anything, any more books coming out, or any, with psilocybin therapy becoming legal, any shift in your practice, anything like that?
Yeah. Well, the main thing that I do right now is I give talks and do interviews like this.
Here we are.
I have my long running podcast, the Entheogenic Evolution. I've been doing that for like 12 years. And I put out an episode a week on that. I'm not currently writing any books. I am in the process of taking my books and making audiobooks out of them. So that's kind of a lengthy process. I've already done, I think, 6 or 7, but I also I've written like 6 novels, and I have a series of 4 novels. They were my first books that I wrote, and I just started the first audiobook for that. So that's like a 4-book series. So that's kind of a big project. Also, I do integration, non-dual entheogenic integration coaching for people online. So for people, especially people who are having a difficult time with their experience, that people can contact me, and I'm available in 30, 60, and 90-minute sessions. I was talking to somebody for like 90 minutes today, someone in the Middle East, actually, just before our interview here. Then for 5 years, I had hosted the Exploring Psychedelics conference here in Ashland, Oregon. I haven't done that over the past couple of years because I developed a really bizarre and sort of mysterious sleep disorder. Back in January of 2019, I went 10 consecutive days without being able to sleep.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really crazy. So I've kind of been on the rebound ever since then. So I haven't been having any conferences. Right before coronavirus hit, I had just started what I was calling Mind Manifesting Movie Night at a local venue, where we would show a documentary about psychedelics and then have conversation afterwards. I got in one of those. It was like the first event I had organized in like over a year because of my sleep disorder. We got one of those, and then coronavirus hit and everything closed down. But one of the exciting things about coronavirus is that now I've given talks at a couple different conferences that I otherwise would not have given talks at, and I have a couple more coming up as well, because now it's all happening online.
Right.
So everybody gets to be in their home and give their talks this way. So I'm still very active in that area in terms of giving talks, from the computer. And then also I make visionary art, so I spend a lot of time working on art. I make a lot of music. And then with the Oregon Psilocybin Services Initiative here in Oregon, if it passes, there will be a 2-year time period where it's going to be the development of what the program will be. And then after that, there is the potential that I could become a licensed psilocybin provider in Oregon. And that's definitely something that I'm open to. But that would be like 2 years down the road from now. So in the meantime, I make a living by selling books, giving consultations. And actually, I just started a new Patreon page for myself. So if people are interested, it's patreon.com/Martin W. Ball. And I have different levels that people can support at and get consultations and art and music and stuff like that.
Especially at a time like this where we are all experiencing this mass trauma, one of the most important things we can have is folks like yourself who can explore this, who have gone through and experienced the trauma and integrated it and done all this inner work that people can talk to and be kind of a mirror and work through their own stuff. So we'll definitely link up all of your work, your Patreon websites. What is the best website where people can kind of find all these works and go down the rabbit hole?
Yeah, well, my main website is just martinball.net. That one's pretty easy. And then my art webpage is called fractalimagination.com. I mean, this is all linked through martinball.net. Okay. And then for consultations is non-dual entheogenic integration.com. Then, my music is on iTunes, and stuff like that, and Spotify and SoundCloud. And my YouTube channel is called The Entheogenic Evolution, named after my podcast. And the podcast is also on iTunes.
12 years once a week. That is a hell of a body of work.
Yeah, well, it was great when I was doing the Exploring Psychedelics conference, because then I would just record everybody's talks, and then I would have weeks and weeks worth of material, months of material putting out all the talks. on the podcast. But there's also lots of interviews, and then also sections from my audiobooks, and then sometimes when I give a lecture that is not otherwise available to the public, that I'll put it on the podcast. So there's a real mix of stuff, from interviews to some of my own talks to lots of different people in the psychedelic movement with talks from presentations and things. So
that's fantastic.
It's a bit diverse.
It's very diverse. I think you definitely, in the work you've done with entheogens, got out of your old patterns, got out of your own way, and tapped into some infinite well of creativity like you're talking about, because you are definitely prodigious in the amount of stuff you're producing and generating and organizing. It's really incredible. And usually I'll have some questions I ask to all my guests at the end of the show. I feel like we've really gone deep and covered these in a meaningful way. You know, if I was going to ask you a mushroom you love, I think I know what the answer would be. So I'll just ask one of the ones I think is most pertinent that I'm curious about. What is the lasting impact you hope to have with this body of work? I mean, and this doesn't have to mean I want to be remembered for this, but just what is it that you hope you're contributing to the greater human experience?
Really, what I feel my most important contribution has been is really the unpacking of non-duality and its accessibility through entheogens. That, again, this all came from my experiences with 5-MeO-DMT. That was really fundamental for me. Back in 2008, when I first started talking about this, most people in the psychedelic community had never heard the word non-duality. They didn't know what it was. And also at that time, most people didn't know what 5-MeO-DMT was, which I like to call the God molecule or the crown jewel of entheogens. And now it's something that is just flourishing across the globe. And I know that I've been a big part of, not personally, going around and giving it to everybody, but I know that what I've shared has inspired a lot of people. And so I hope the lasting impact is the reality that there really is only one being, and that we are all that, and that we all have what I consider a fundamental birthright to experience that for ourselves. That's what I really hope gets through to people. For me, that's going all the way. And I think the more people who can go all the way and then step out of their belief systems, step out of their dogmas, step out of their structures and say, I accept this because I know it's true, and now I'm going to live from that place, that's what's going to hold the greatest potential to transform human society. So that's what I hope my contribution is. And along the way, I hope people enjoy my art and music and stuff like that, because I enjoy it. And I'd like them to enjoy it as well.
And I think you did unpack non-duality in a way that really unifies and reconciles so many things, issues that I had with previous teachings about it, how you integrate the idea of form and purpose and morality. I really appreciate the work you've done, and in reading your book, most specifically the book that I think folks must read is called Being Human. It really gives you a whole different worldview, even if you don't want to go and call it your own, like I'm kind of doing here as well. I think it's really a well laid out worldview that's really impactful. So yeah, I definitely think you are having that impact. Well, Martin, thank you so much for coming on. We've been talking about 2 hours, and I could just sit here and listen to you talk. I'm like having a psychedelic experience right now, just hearing you talk about this stuff. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on the Mushroom Hour and sharing with us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
All right. Well, I guess it's been a double dose of the Mushroom Hour then.
It's been the double Mushroom Hour.
Yeah.
Well worth it.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's been a great conversation. Enjoyed it very much.